Welcome, everyone. It's Dr. Lindner. We are looking at neurology, and in this next topic, we're going to be focusing on, at least in this PowerPoint, we're going to talk about the spinal cord, and we will also talk about spinal nerves. So when we talk about the brain and the spinal cord combined, the brain and spinal cord, that forms the central neural system. In terms of the spinal cord, it's very, very important when we talk about the CNS, the spinal cord specifically. There are many reflexes that take place at the level of the spinal cord, and I'll go over several reflexes and the reflex arc. Within the spinal cord, we have the integration of impulses, meaning the summation of either inhibitory or the summation of excitatory nerve impulses. And within the spinal cord acts as the highway for sensory and motor information in terms of sensory information ascends and goes up into the brain, and then motor information descends and goes out. So within the spinal cord, it acts as a highway of communication of the upward or ascending or afferent or sensory information. And the spinal cord acts as the highway of communication for motor pathways or descending pathways or efferent pathways. Okay. So, whoops, let's bring that back. Now, in terms of protection of the spinal cord, we do have some layers of protection, and some of those are hard tissue, and some of those are going to be soft tissue. When I say hard tissue, well, we've got the vertebrae, right? So the vertebrae is going to protect the spinal cord, but we have soft tissue. And when we talk about soft tissue, we have to talk about the meninges. And then we also have cerebral spinal fluid that flows in here to help buoy and cushion the spinal cord. So we've got bone, we've got connective tissue, we've got, when we talk about connective tissue, we're talking about the meninges, and then in fluid, we are talking about cerebral spinal fluid. So let's take a look at the layers that protect the spinal cord. Let's take a look at all the different layers. Now, the vertebrae is the one that you don't see here. So the vertebra has been removed, but just deep to the vertebra, we're going to have the epidural space. And the epidural space is filled with fat. Now, just deep to that, we're going to have the dura mater, which is the outermost meninge. That's dense, irregular connective tissue. Then just under the dura is the subdural space, and that's filled with interstitial fluid. Then the next layer deep to that is going to be the arachnoid, which is the middle layer. And arachnoid comes from like arachnophobia, like spider. It's spider web appearance under microscope. And it's composed primarily of collagen fibers. And then deep to the arachnoid is the subarachnoid space. And that's the region of which cerebral spinal fluid flows. So where does CSF flow? Between which layers? It's going to flow within the subarachnoid space. Now remember, what makes the CSF are those ependymal cells, which is a type of neuroglial cell. Then we move to the innermost layer, which is the pia mater. The pia mater is the thin layer, and it is the innermost layer that's actually closest to the spinal cord itself. Okay. So if we take another look from this picture, we can see the vertebrae. We could see the dura mater, which is the outermost. It's the actual layer that's closest to the bone, and it means tough mother. Then we have the arachnoid, which is the middle layer. And then we have the pia mater, which is the innermost layer. Then we have the spinal cord itself. And when we look at the spinal cord, we can see the spinal nerve. Okay. When you look at the spinal nerve is both, it's considered to be a mixed nerve because there's sensory and motor component to that nerve, which is why it's considered a mixed nerve. So this portion back here, the dorsal root is sensory. And the ventral root is motor. And can we differentiate between the dorsal root compared to the ventral root? Well, we remember from a previous video that the dorsal root has this swollen nodule right here, right? Which is a group of nerve cell bodies that are located outside of the CNS or in the PNS, and we refer to that as a ganglia. So we have a dorsal root ganglia that's always in the dorsal, the back, going into the dorsal horn. That's the dorsal horns. And then over here, you've got your ventral horns, which is gray matter. Now we know that these are dorsal horns and these are ventral, not just by looking at the dorsal root ganglia, but if you look at the vertebrae, here's the spinous process, which we know is posterior, and on the anterior, you got the vertebral body. So more posterior has to be the dorsal root, and on the same side as the vertebral body has to be the ventral root. And the butterfly, or the letter H in the center, is gray matter, meaning it's unmyelinated. And then surrounding that, all around that gray matter, is the myelinated white matter. Okay, good place for our first break.